Welcome, everybody. My name is John Renne. This is Transportation Research Board Committee on Transportation Land Development webinar on facilitating historic preservation through transit-oriented development. This is going to be a 2-hour webinar. We're starting at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we are, if you are AICP, there will be 2 credits available for this webinar. Okay, I'm trying to advance the slide. Okay. As I mentioned, I'm the chair of the Committee on Transportation and Land Development from the Transportation Research Board. So I want to thank my colleagues at TRB for helping to host this webinar. I'd also like to thank our sponsors of this webinar. In no particular order, the American Planning Association Florida chapter of the Treasure Coast section. They have graciously helped to provide the CM credits for this, so thank you very much to the Treasure Coast section of APA Florida. The Texas A&M Transportation Institute. This study was funded through the Southwest University Transportation Center, which is a program as part of the University Transportation Center program, part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. They helped to fund the research as well as the guidebook that we'll be presenting and the video. This would not have been possible without them, so thank you very much. The Transit-Oriented Development Institute, Andy Kuntz, thank you very much for helping to advertise and broadcast this to your many subscribers, and to the Florida Atlantic University Center for Urban Environmental Solutions, a center that I direct at FAU. I would also like to thank FAU's support for helping to make this webinar happen. We have several speakers today, including myself and David Listokin. The 2 of us will speak first, followed by Jim Amdal, who's a colleague of mine for many years from the University of New Orleans, Marcel Wisznia, president of Wisznia Architecture and Development in New Orleans, and Press Kabacoff, the executive chairman of the board of directors for HRI Properties. I will introduce Jim and Marcel and Press as it gets closer, but I do want to note that, as I mentioned, I am director and associate professor at the Center for Urban Environmental Solutions in the School of Urban Regional Planning at Florida Atlantic University. And David Listokin is a distinguished professor and co-director of the Center for Urban Policy Research at the Edward J. Blasting School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. We worked on this project with several others, including Jim Amdal, and this has been a multi-year effort, and we're really excited to announce and to launch this new set of tools that will hopefully help professionals in the field. The outline of this webinar is we're going to first watch a short 5 or 6 minute overview video, which some of you may have seen, but maybe not all of you. Plus, it gives you the opportunity to kind of meet us, because all of us who are speaking today are also featured on this video. And the Texas A&M Transportation Institute did such a great job with the video. David and his team, I thought it would be great to show that video. Then, as I mentioned, David and I will present the guide to facilitate historic preservation through transit-oriented development. Then we're going to have Jim, Marcel, and Press talk about some great examples that we studied in New Orleans. And then we'll have time for questions and answers. So, to begin, we're going to watch this short little video. Oh, of course, it's not working right now, so bear with me here. I'm going to open up a web browser. Okay. Can everybody hear the audio? Transit development
Barely.
typically within a 5 or 10 minute walk of a railway station that allows. Is the audio not coming through? Live, work,
No.
play in that district. We're going to skip the video, and there are links to the video in the advertising for this, and we'd be happy to email you this when we're done, so I apologize for that. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the background research report. So before we put together this guidebook, we worked as a team to look at the intersection of historic preservation and transit-oriented development. That entailed looking at the literature. We did a national quantitative analysis where we examined the historic property data along with data on from the National TOD database and census data. We had meetings with field experts. We conducted 8 detailed case studies, and we conducted a state-level analysis of the availability of data on historic preservation, because as you'll see in here, historic properties can be designated at a national level. They can also be designated at state and local levels. So we did all of that in this report. The full report can be found, the full report's called The Opportunities and Tensions of Historic Preservation and Transit-Oriented Development, and there's the web link for it there. Again, that web link is on the advertising for this webinar, and we'd be happy to send out all these web links to you afterwards so you could take a look at it. But this particular webinar is going to focus on the guide to facilitate historic preservation through transit-oriented development. This is the cover you can see here on the screen. The purpose of this guidebook is that this guidebook aims to help you better understand TOD historic preservation interaction. It also aims to help you understand the tensions and opportunities of this interaction and provide tools to coordinate both. So David and I were talking earlier, and for some of you that are work in transit-oriented development, the stuff that we're presenting on may not be new for you. Maybe the historic preservation stuff is new. And for those in historic preservation, maybe you might find some new resources on transit-oriented development. So what we're trying to do with this project and this guidebook is to bring it both together and to show that there can be synergy between historic preservation and transit-oriented development. One of the projects I think that really inspired this research is the Gates Rubber Factory in Denver. That was one of the most iconic historic buildings in Denver, and a few years ago it was demolished, and it didn't have to be. It had, I believe, the opportunity to be preserved. And part of the reason that it was demolished is because it was not seen as being compatible with the goals for transit-oriented development. It was too contaminated. It was the building didn't quite line up with what some of the visions planned for. So at the time, Press Kabacoff and I were looking at that building in Denver, and Press, who will speak later from HRI Properties, has been a leader in restoring buildings like that, and tried to go after that project with Dana Crawford, who, if you know Denver, Dana is well known in Denver for infill development and historic preservation and transit-oriented development. They named the hotel at Union Station in downtown Denver after Dana Crawford. And as a team, we were unsuccessful in doing anything about the demolition of that building. So for me, that's when it really came to light that we need to do something more to ensure that we can better coordinate historic preservation and transit development. So who are the audience? The audience are community activists, developers, local government, redevelopment authorities, transit agencies. Basically anybody that's interested in this topic is the audience. So what is the guide contained. So Chapter 2 presents the background and context. There's a brief background of TOD and historic preservation, a discussion of the opportunities and tensions for TOD and historic preservation across the United States. Chapter 3 discusses tools to promote TOD. Chapter 4 gets into historic designation and regulation. Chapter 5 discusses historic preservation financial aids to preserve historic buildings, especially within the context of TODs. Chapter 6 discusses transfer development rights as a tool to redirect growth within TODs. And Chapter 7 discusses the role of stakeholders and public-private partnerships. Again, we're going to go through all of these, but that's the overview. So Chapter 2, the background and context. We go through some benefits of TOD and some benefits of historic preservation. Both have benefits to the environment. Transit development is seen as trying to get people out of their cars, create more walking, more cycling, more transit use, and fewer greenhouse gas emissions. Historic preservation also has some significant benefits to the environment because there's a whole lot of embodied energy in existing buildings, and to knock down a building and to rebuild from scratch actually wastes a lot of energy that's already embedded within the original construction of those historic buildings. TOD has benefits to the economy, as does historic preservation. TOD benefits include increased economic opportunities, new jobs, new local tax revenue. Historic preservation similarly can achieve same goals. Creates new jobs. It can create an anchor for infill communities. It can create vibrancy, and it can create the placemaking that a lot of communities are striving to achieve, that you just can't build buildings in 2016 the way they were built a century or more ago, because of the quality of the construction and the techniques used back in the past don't necessarily replicate to what we build today. Transit development has benefits to the community. There are benefits to coordinating people living near transit systems, which can reduce the overall household and transportation costs to residents. TODs often contain higher levels of renters and provides more housing options than your typical suburban community, for example. And many TODs are starting to really become places for affordable housing, which is very much needed in many regions around the country. On the historic preservation side, those same benefits can apply, repurposing old, abandoned, underutilized buildings into retail, office space, residential space, affordable housing, creates a sense of place, culture, artistic communities. I think you're going to see some of those examples when, particularly when Marcel presents on some of his projects in New Orleans. And when we look at the growth of the interest in historic preservation, in 1970, there were only about 2,500 listings and about 200 local historic districts in the United States. Well, today, there's more than 90,000 listings, and there are more than 3,000 local historic districts. But with that said, there comes both opportunities and tensions surrounding these two fields. On the opportunity side, we have the opportunity to preserve history. We have the opportunity to draw in new tenants that can fill underutilized buildings, which promotes transit use. And we can create projects that set the style of a particular area. But at the same token, the tensions can include that designers of new buildings in TODs sometimes feel that the historic buildings don't conform to the sort of development they want to see. The buildings might not be tall enough. They may not fit the floor templates that they're looking to achieve for modern-day big box retail shopping, for example. And it sometimes can pose challenges to businesses because of the financial, building codes, or other challenges. So it may just, like the Gates example in Denver, might simply be easier just to wipe the slate clean and start from new. And of course, we hope with this work that there will be hopefully people that may think of that may reconsider those ideas and to think how they can use historic buildings to enhance a TOD rather than to view historic buildings as a detraction from a TOD. Also, in our research, we found a significant connection between transit-oriented developments and rail stations and historic properties. And it's somewhat common sense. We know that a lot of train stations were built some time ago in our country in historic downtown locations. So we found in the data that 50% of fixed route transit stations are within a half a mile of a National Historic District. With the half a mile is typically the TOD area. 36% of National Historic Districts are within a half mile of a fixed route transit station, and 10% of individually listed National Historic Buildings are located within a half mile of a fixed route transit station. So we also conducted some case studies for this project, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but here are just some of them. I mentioned Denver and the Gates Rubber Factory as an example where the building had been demolished. We have some examples from Washington, D.C., some examples from New Orleans that we're going to hear more about later in this presentation, examples from Memphis, Tennessee, and two examples from Dallas, Texas, and one example from New Brunswick, New Jersey. I'm not going to read into these anymore. They're all in the report, and you could read very much more in-depth of these case studies in the actual full technical report that I referenced earlier. So I'm going to go through some of the TOD tools, and then I'm going to pass the presentation over to David Listokin, who will go through more of the historic preservation side, since that's his expertise. So on the TOD side of things, what we were really trying to show is to folks who may be coming at this from a historic preservation background that you don't have to reinvent the wheel when it comes to understanding what tools are out there for transit-oriented development. First of all, it's important to understand who are the stakeholders involved in promoting transit-oriented development. They could be public and nonprofit developers, local neighborhood organizations, local government, and local agencies. Sometimes, for example, redevelopment authorities may work separately from local zoning jurisdictions. Transit agencies are often separate. Metropolitan planning organizations and state agencies, including DOTs, environmental agencies, and other state agencies from time to time can get involved. Now, it's important to note here that each of these different stakeholders often have different goals and objectives for what they want to get out of a transit-oriented development. So, for example, developers often need to make a profit to be able to return to their investors. Transit agencies want to see increased transit ridership. Metropolitan planning organizations and state agencies are often concerned with bigger picture traffic congestion, increasing mobility and accessibility, reducing regional greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, TOD doesn't mean the same thing to everybody, so that's important to recognize. So when looking around the literature and the different sorts of organizations that have been working on putting forward TOD tools, we found 3 organizations that have really provided TOD tools at the national level. Now, this is not a comprehensive list of all TOD tools out there. Many local governments, metropolitan planning organizations, and in some cases state transportation departments have put out, and even transit agencies have put out tools and guidebooks for transit-oriented development. So these are really just the national organizations that have been working on this. So first is the Reconnecting America Center for Transit-Oriented Development, and then the Transportation Research Board and Smart Growth America. I'm going to summarize these pretty quickly because the goal is not really to go through each of these, but so that you know where to go to get the information that you need. So the Reconnecting America's Center for Trans-Oriented Development, and I will say that Reconnecting America is no longer an operating organization. They're a nonprofit organization, but they still have an active website, and the information that the work that they did, all these different tools are still available on their website. They created a whole series of guidebooks. For example, TOD 101, Why Trans-Oriented Development and Why Now? TOD 201, Mixed Income Housing Near Transit, Increasing Affordability with Location Efficiency. So you can see here that they've put out a number of really user-friendly guidebooks on really specific topics that get to the heart of different elements of transit-oriented development. And you can go to these guidebooks and these reports and really dig deep into the specifics that you would need to relevant to the topic that you're looking for. The Transportation Research Board has also published a number of reports that provide significant guidance and research on transit-oriented development. The, you know, I don't have the years here, but I believe this was from 1999. The Zoning and Real Estate Implications of Trans-Oriented Development was one of the first reports that came out on transit-oriented development and looked through some legal issues related to transit-oriented development and joint development. Robert Severo published a report in 2004, him and a team that he worked with, called Transit-Oriented Development in the United States, Experiences, Challenges, and Prospects. That report is one of the seminal works done in transit-oriented development, in that it was very comprehensive and it looked at all sorts of information you know, about transit-oriented development with case studies all over the United States. There was Transit-Oriented Development and Joint Development in the United States, a literature review that came out, Transit-Oriented Development, Developing a Strategy to Measure Success, Effects of TOD on Housing, Parking, and Travel, Traveler Response to System Changes Handbook, Chapter 17 on Transit-Oriented Development, and Transit-Oriented and Joint Development Case Studies and Legal Issues. Now, there are also some other TRB reports that do speak to the integration of land use and transportation planning and very much speak to the heart of transit-oriented development, but we believe that these are in you know, really focusing on transit-oriented development, where some of those other reports can certainly be applied to transit-oriented development, but not specifically on transit-oriented development. And then most recently, Smart Growth America won a competition from the Federal Transit Administration to become the TOD technical assistance arm of the Federal Transit Administration with regards to TOD. And they launched this new website recently called todresources.org. And it's a portal where you can find many of the reports that I've shown here and many, many other reports. And it basically provides a website repository for these TOD resources. They also have a call for grants, and they provide local technical assistance to communities through an application, competitive application process. So I'm sure we will be hearing a lot more from Smart Growth America in the near future as they continue to unveil their program, which is now very much active. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to my colleague David Listokin, who's going to talk about the historic designation and regulation process, as well as other tools related to historic preservation.
Sure. Well, first, if I can echo something that John said, some of the things as I go through in historic preservation will be elementary for those who are preservationists, but for people in the transportation community, it's good to get the overview. And actually, one of the nice things about the study that we were involved in over the last few years was that we brought together the people from the preservation community and the transportation and TOD communities, and there was a dialogue that was started. So again, with that in mind, I'm going to give you really some ABCs associated with historic preservation. So starting first with designating a property, you're identifying, officially recognizing a property as historic. But before I talk about that, if we're talking about historic preservation, we need a little history. So very quick on preservation history in the United States. It's really quite recent. For most of the nation's history, we really didn't have a preservation ethic. There were the exceptions. We preserved Independence Hall, we preserved Mount Vernon, we preserved Old South Church in Boston, but basically the ethic in the country was new. We prided ourselves on doing things new. There were some outliers. So Charleston and New Orleans in the 1930s established the first local historic commissions and identified and started to protect properties. But those were the outliers. When you think about it, urban renewal program and the interstate highway program in the 1950s and 1960s, just the emphasis was clearly on demolition and new. So in part because of that, in 1966, we have the National Historic Preservation Act, which establishes the National Register of Historic Places. All right. And it says that we will identify and designate resources that meet certain criteria. And without going through the detail, we have the A, B, C, and D criteria. So A is, we're talking about resources associated with history. B, resources associated with prominent persons. C, resources that are distinctive in terms of architecture. And D, resources important from an archaeological perspective. So, and you often will have resources that are considered significant to go on the National Register for multiple of those reasons. All right. So let's say now you have a resource that has been placed on the National Register of Historic Places. What are the consequences? Well, clearly you're identifying that resource, that you have this official imprimatur. It's identified as historic. It may or may not lead to state and local landmarking. It does provide, if something is either on or eligible for the National Register, there are certain review procedures. So if there's a federal undertaking, you have to see how does that undertaking affect something on or eligible for the register. You have NEPA and other types of reviews that are activated when you have a resource on the National Register. However, it doesn't stop adverse government action. It really just requires this review and procedure, even though that's important. The idea is that we'll have a breathing spell in order to preserve the resource. It does provide, and this is very important from the financial perspective, providing you meet the other criteria, you can receive a 20% federal historic tax credit, but you have to meet the criteria. So, for example, if you're an owner-occupied property as opposed to an income-producing property, you don't qualify for the historic tax credit, even though if you're on the National Register. And you may get other types of federal assistance. One thing to clear up a misunderstanding, if you're on the National Register, it does not, let me repeat again, restrict the private use of a property. You can alter it, you can demolish it. So the federal government started with the, again, National Register and identification and designation, and given our system of government with dynamic federalism, we also have state and local designation. So speaking first on the state designation, in many respects it parallels what happens at the federal level. So you'll have a state will establish a state register of historic places. The criteria will often mirror the criteria for going on the National Register of Historic Places. And if you're on the state register, then various state actions that would affect something on the state register may very well have to be reviewed. What's of more consequence is really local designation. So I mentioned earlier that Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans were the first local communities to have local historic commissions that would designate properties. This has then been followed by many other communities in the United States. The criteria for local designation may very well mimic the National Register criteria, the ABCD criteria, or it may be broader. So, for example, to be on the National Register, typically you have to be at least 50 years old. Well, you'll have some local designation that said that's too long. So in New York City, for an example, the age threshold is 30 years, and there's a much broader sense of what would qualify for going on, being identified and being designated by the New York City Historic Commission. Now, not always, but sometimes, if you're locally designated, then there are some stringent after effects. You may not be able to demolish the property. You may not be able to make changes to the property that would be incompatible with the fabric. That doesn't mean you can't adaptively reuse and rehab the property. It's just that there is a level of scrutiny. So let's think for a moment about the consequences of historic designation. Yes, especially in the case of local designation, there are restrictions. However, there are offsetting benefits. One, various studies, some of which I've been involved with, have indicated that being designated, even controlling for standard real estate factors, enhances property values. Connected to that, in part why you may have an enhancement of property values, is that you're keeping this historic fabric, which many people and increasing numbers of people value. Also, something I'll talk about momentarily, if you are designated, it then opens up a number of very important tax credits and other incentives. So why don't I turn to that? So what are some of the programs, aids, credits that would be available to an historic resource, as well as some other programs that are not specifically targeted to historic but can be used by an historic property? So the overview slide that is just what it says. So it identifies a number of incentives and aids: the federal historic tax credit, the state historic tax credit, the new market tax credit. We'll talk shortly about some property tax incentives, as well as some transportation programs that can be used in a historic context. But why don't I give you a sense of the tax credits? What happens, we have all these acronyms and you can get confused. So we have historic tax credits. It really started, the federal government in the late 70s and then the early 80s started with that. Originally it was a 25% credit. It's now a 20% credit. So if you do $1 million rehabilitation project, you would secure $200,000 in reduction of your taxes, and you take that immediately. Starting in the 1990s, you have some states piggybacked onto that federal historic tax credit, and they have state historic tax credits. About 35 states have that. The credit varies between 5 and 50%, and that credit is available immediately. There's a federal commercial rehabilitation credit. This is not for historic properties, but rather just for older commercial buildings, those that are 1936 and older, built 1936 and older, and that gives you a 10% credit on the rehabilitation. Not specific to historic properties, but often used in conjunction with historic properties, and the low-income housing tax credit that was started in 1986, and it gives you a 90% credit over 10 years, and the new market tax credit started in 2000, that gives you a 39% credit spread over 7 years. So without giving you the blow-by-blow, because all of these credits tend to be quite technical and you have to look at the requirements, but just to give you, a sense of some of the important steps and criteria. So with respect to the federal historic tax credit, And again, that's the 20% credit. The $1 million rehabilitation project, would realize a $200,000 credit. Well, not so surprisingly, they want the resource to be historically important, so it's either listed individually on the register or contributes to a registered district. They want that rehab to have a certain threshold in terms of significance of dollar value, so that has to be met. And not so surprisingly, if they're giving you a 20% credit on an historic property, they want that rehabilitation to be appropriate in terms of the fabric of that building. So what are some of the benefits of the federal historic tax credit? Well, again, it's a very significant subsidy. 20% credit. That $1 million project is getting $200,000 in dollar-for-dollar reduction against taxes. It can be used with housing. So, for example, the federal historic tax credit over its life has been associated with the rehabilitation of over 500,000 housing units. About 30% were affordable, and they were affordable besides using the federal historic tax credit, because often these projects used other subsidies, and that's this concept of piggybacking. We use not just one credit or incentives or aids, but multiple. And some of the piggybacking that you find with the federal historic tax credit very frequently is with the state historic tax credit, and it may very well involve using the low-income housing tax credit, the new market tax credit, and various property tax incentives. I'll talk briefly about some of these. So, starting first on the low-income housing tax credit and the state historic tax credit. So in 1986, we started to move to subsidizing affordable housing by using the LIHTC, and it gives both a 4% credit and a 9% credit. The most generous is obviously the 9% credit. That's annual over a 10-year period, so you can see that that's quite an extensive subsidy. Of course, you have to be providing affordable housing, which is a challenge. And basically, every state has a certain allocation of low-income housing tax credits, and there is a very significant competition to secure those credits. The state historic tax credit was really piggybacking and inspired by the federal historic tax credit. Well, as the federal historic tax credit had a significant impact in encouraging rehabilitation, the states felt, well, we'll add to that, and you often need both the combination of the federal historic tax credit and the state historic tax credit. So there are about 35 states in the United States that offer a federal historic tax credit. You see that in the map. And again, you have to look at each state's program. They may mirror what the federal historic tax credit is. So, for example, the federal historic tax credit is limited to income-producing properties, but some of the state historic tax credits, you can have a homeowner-occupied historic property would be eligible. And again, you have to look at each state's criteria for the state historic tax credits in terms of the specific properties that qualify, the amount of investment that's needed. There's sometimes minimums, maximums, and so on. But the important point is that a large number of states, 35 states, are offering the state historic tax credit, which is often piggybacked over the federal historic tax credit. Let me just mention very quickly on the new market tax credits. So in part it was inspired by these other tax credits, the low-income housing tax credit and the historic tax credit, saying, well, that's the strategy we'll use to incentivize behavior. So the new market tax credit was authorized in 2000. It gives a 39% credit over 7 years. You get a 5% credit annually the first 3 years and a 6% credit over the next 4 years. These credits go to community development entities, and people invest in those CDEs because they're then securing that 39% credit. And the CDEs in turn invest, they lend, etc. And actually, interestingly, the new market tax credits has often been associated with real estate type projects. So again, you're having this piggybacking going on. You may very well have a project with federal historic tax credits and new market tax credits. So let's turn to another aid, tax increment financing, often abbreviated as a TIF. In essence, what you're doing here is taking the lemonade of property taxes, or the lemon of property taxes, and turning it into the lemonade of an aid for a project. And you know, very simply, even though it's not a simple program, you designate a district. You then freeze the property values in that district for a given period of time. So in Chicago, for example, that used to be 23 years, and then as property values increase in that district over time, so normally that appreciation to which you would apply the local property tax rate would go into the public coffers. But what you have in a TIF is that for the period of time, whatever it is, the 10, 20 years, that appreciation is then applied back to the project. And again, that could be a very important aid. You see two examples on this slide. Both the King Edward and Standard Life buildings were using TIFs. Let's turn to some other aids. The Federal Transportation Assistance. Sometimes transportation has been a challenge to preservation, but you do have the opposite. So here we're talking about some of these acronym programs, the 1991, the AICP program, and the 1998 T21 program, and the 2005 Safety Loop program, and the 2013 MAP 21 program. These were huge transportation programs. Each of them had a component for transportation enhancement activities, and we were talking about, you know, very consequential amounts in the billions of dollars. And the short story is that the TEAs can be very useful both to TOD as well as to historic preservation. So as a matter of fact, if you look at the eligible criteria for TEAs, sometimes historic preservation is mentioned specifically, and then some other TEA applications can either directly or indirectly be used for preservation or TOD, such as rehabbing historic transportation infrastructure and the like. Let me briefly talk about, and not do justice to, TDR, another acronym here, Transfer of Development Rights. So what exactly is TDR? Well, in the TDR program, it's a strategy to allow increased development in certain places where you think that development is important or appropriate. So it's served by transit, or it's environmentally suitable, or it has the infrastructure. And in return, you have reduced development in places that are deemed less suitable for development. You know, environmentally fragile, historically important locations, farmland, etc. So, and then you have both sending and receiving zones. So, for example, if I'm using TDR to preserve farmland, I would send away the development rights from the farmland into, let's say, centers where there's transit and infrastructure. Bottom line, TDR is an important strategy both for TOD. I mean, let's face it, what you want to do in TOD is maximize density near transit, and TDR may very well facilitate that. Also, TDR can help preserve historic resources. So what you can do is to say, yes, we will designate an historic property. It may very well not be built out to a highest and best use, but that property will reap the benefit of selling the development rights. And the development rights might very well go to more suitable new construction by transit, which will encourage the maximum density and utilization of the TOD. So again, we went through some very complex programs and incentives quickly. There is more detail in the base document. And now John will speak on what's very key. It's not just dollars when you're trying to do these things, but it's public-private partnerships.
Thank you, David. So I'm going to just talk briefly about the role of stakeholders and public-private partnerships in promoting transit-oriented development and historic preservation. And I've done some work on this topic in New Jersey and in Perth, Western Australia, and also now here in South Florida. What we see is that there are a number of different stakeholder groups that could be associated with on the transit-oriented development side as well as the historic preservation side, and they range from individuals, landowners, public, private, non-governmental organizations, all the way down from the local grassroots site level all the way up to regional, state agencies, and in some cases even federal agencies. Public-private partnerships are increasingly becoming a way in which transit-oriented developments can be implemented, because in lots of cases the public sector, the transit agency, or local government owns property at or near train stations that can be repurposed into the development for a transit-oriented development, and in some cases these even include historic railway station buildings themselves. Now, what we found in the Memphis case study was that the train station itself was repurposed, and what happened was if the public sector did it themselves, they wouldn't be eligible for the federal historic tax credits. So they were able to, in essence, lease that building or give the building to the private sector to come in and develop it, who could then take advantage of that program to bring in those federal resources. So from that example specifically, there's a tremendous financial advantage to having a public-private partnership, because again, the public sector is not going to be able to take advantage of a historic tax credit, whether it's federal, state, or local. With regards to public-private partnerships, there's also other tools that can be used to share development costs or to share revenues, for example, between the public sector and the private sector. There's station connection fees, for example, building on surface parking lots. All of these things are incredibly important when it comes to thinking about transit-oriented development. Now, not every transit-oriented development requires a public-private partnership, but they are quite important. So I just want to kind of showcase really here a couple, we kind of went through the outline of the report chronologically from beginning to end. This is what we have in the appendices. Appendix A kind of just provides an overview snapshot of each of the case studies in case you wanted to kind of understand what the land uses were and the preservation realization. We looked at the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 examples where preservation was realized, one example in New Brunswick where it was kind of a mixed bag, and then the, as I mentioned, the Gates Rubber Factory in Denver where the preservation was not realized and the building was demolished. So I think you can learn some good examples from each of those. We also have an appendix that looks at key land use and design considerations for promoting transit-oriented development. And at first what we tried to do was we tried to see, was there anything unique and common across all of these case studies and examples? And what we actually found is that there wasn't. There was different programs, different considerations used in all of the case studies, and while some of the case studies obviously had a lot of duplication of some of these considerations, there was not a one-size-fits-all answer. And we also have Appendix C that looks at some of the qualifications for investment tax credits, which I'm not going to get into this, but again, you can go to the guidebook. It's it's a free PDF that you could download, and also if you want more detailed information, you could go to the original reports, which is on the Southwest University Transportation Center website at the Texas A&M Transportation Institute, and again, we'll share all of those links with you. So now I want to pass the presentation to Jim Amdal. Jim is a senior fellow at the Merritt Becker Transportation Institute at the University of New Orleans, and he is the chairman of the Central Business District Historic District Landmarks Commission. Jim was a part of our research team, but he's also been practicing TOD, streetcars, and historic preservation for many years. So Jim, welcome.
Thank you, John. Well, I have been in the field of preservation and neighborhood activism for roughly 30 years. I've been on the Historic District Landmarks Commission since 1998, and I've served as the chairman since 2002. To begin with, preservation is a key element in the psyche, the image, the perception, and the reality that is New Orleans in contemporary times. But according to a historian that recently came to town to give a presentation to the Historic New Orleans collection, this phenomenon of tourism driving a significant portion of the city's economy goes back to roughly 1900. And we were faced in the mid-70s with some horrific implications as it related to the Superdome, the newly constructed arena downtown, and its effect on property owners and their wish to demolish. So, oddly enough, our current mayor's father, Mitch Landrieu, Moon Landrieu, together with the power brokers at the time, which was a Central Area Committee of the Chamber of Commerce, got together and collected money, hired Wallace, Roberts, and Todd out of Philadelphia to do a growth management plan. And that growth management plan was significant in that it created a number of tools that we have used locally, including the historic districts themselves, the control of demolition through that designation, the creation of a special taxing district called the Downtown Development District, who have funded many projects that have benefited the historic fabric of the downtown. They were also key in funding the initial efforts by the historic Fulberg St. Mary Corporation for blight reduction, i.e. elimination, which has been tremendously successful. In my former life as a consultant, my first office was on Julia Street at 612. That was historically the nexus of the homeless population. It was a really bad place to be. I authored the initial warehouse district preservation development study. At the time I did that in the early 80s, you could literally walk over bodies in the sidewalk getting to my client's office, which was at 604 Julia. So in the 35 years that I've been practicing in New Orleans, there has been remarkable change. But it all started with the realization that we have got to control our destiny. And that was the wisdom of Moon Landrieu and the Central Area Committee to create the Historic District Landmarks designations. There are 5 districts within the Central Business District, and we abut the French Quarter, which was one of the first designated historic districts in the country. So we have a key role in that we don't control, but we advise the city council on projects that are occurring within the historic districts themselves. So we are the first hurdle that every developer has to go up and present to and hopefully be approved. Most of the time we are successful, all the time we're not. But it has been extremely beneficial, and I think Marcel and Press can attest to this, over the years, to guiding the appropriate development and infill throughout the downtown. So I'll be available to answer any questions at the end. John?
Jim, thank you very much. Do you just want to say maybe a few words kind of about the role of the resurgence of streetcars in New Orleans and how that has helped to enhance the kind of the connections between the historic properties and the transitory development opportunities?
Yeah. In 2012, I did a study on the impacts of the Loyola streetcar, which was a new streetcar line that was funded 100% by the U.S. DOT. It was estimated that it was going to cost $45 million. That's what they spent, and then some, and then $15 million more. But because of that, and Marcel has got several projects on or right near the streetcar lines, the domain companies, which are 2 young, not so young now, developers who had graduated from Tulane, they came back to New Orleans post-Katrina, decided that there was a great opportunity, and decided to help the city recover from the storm. Well, they did that, but relative to TOD, they made a decision to build what is now about a $500 million mixed-use project called South Market District on the Loyola streetcar line. And it was done specifically because of that streetcar, as was the rehabilitation and reorientation of the Hyatt Hotel next to the Superdome. There have been the original it's a Masonic lodge for blacks. My mind just went blank. But there has been probably $800 million expended on that corridor, and it's less than a mile long.
Jim, that project you were trying to remember is called the Pythian.
Pythian. Thank you, Marcel. So the streetcar has been incredibly successful, not from a ridership perspective, but from an economic development perspective. Now, conversely, when I got into this business 30 years ago, Press and I were involved in the creation of the first new historic streetcar system in New Orleans. It was along the riverfront. It was in 1984 that we hatched this idea, and what we ended up doing was using a historic streetcar to link what was under construction post 1984 World's Fair, $1.3 billion worth of development. So in that case, we had the development, but we did not have a means to link them. So we created the link. We had to jump through all kinds of hoops with the feds to do it. We kept telling them, gentlemen, this is not going to lose money. It's going to make money. Well, we don't believe you. So nevertheless, from the day that it opened, it never lost a dime. And it's been an incredible project from the get-go, and it remains strong, and it's the model for what the Regional Transit Authority has now done in several other instances throughout the city.
Well, Jim, thank you very much. We're going to shift gears now, or not even shift gears. We're going to build upon Jim's presentation. Marcel Wisznia, who is an architect and the president of Wisznia Architecture and Development. He's a local developer in New Orleans, very much at the forefront of these issues, is going to talk to you about his projects that fit this exact target. Welcome, Marcel.
Thank you, John. Number one, it's a pleasure to be part of this panel, and I'm excited to share some case studies of our work. But before I do so, let me take a minute and give you a little bit of our history. I'm the second generation of a family practice, founded in 1947, founded by my father, Walter Wisznia, in Corpus Christi, Texas. And my father and our family was not really a typical Texas family. Both my parents were European born. My father was born in Vienna, then schooled in Paris, went to boarding school in Brighton, England, ended up immigrating to the U.S., going to Columbia University in New York City, studying architecture, ended up in a small city in Texas, in Corpus Christi, Texas, practiced there for 58 years. And I came to New Orleans in the late 1960s to go to college, to go to Tulane University. I also studied architecture and did not want to go back to Texas and be the boss's son. Was really too immature and too idealistic to go work for anyone, so I opened my own practice right out of college. So here, a good portion of this webinar is not only focused on TODs, but focused on historic preservation. And growing up in the city I grew up in with a very modern architect, I really had very little sensitivity to historic structures. And in spite of schooling here for 5 years and beginning my career here, I really didn't have the level of sensitivity that I could and should have with our historic fabric that certainly is the uniqueness of our city. And it's taken me many years to really embrace it. And so I cannot really call myself a preservationist. I will tell you that I'm highly sensitive today to historic structures, but I also believe that you don't have to mimic the past, that you can move, that you can take a historic structure and move it from the past through the present into the future. And I believe that if you understand the rhythm and the scale and the proportions of the past, you can look to the future. Our practice is unique today in the fact that we are both, as the slide shows, both architects and developers, and our practice today only focuses on real estate development, and our architectural division only serves us as real estate developers. So I'd like to show you a few case studies of projects that we have completed, and I think what you'll find interesting about all of them is they all carry one theme, and they all are on streetcar lines. We started with a very unique project, about a 50,000 square foot building in the heart of downtown New Orleans. That was the old Western Union Telegraph building, built in 1927, about a 50,000 square foot, 4-story building. And we used that really as what I'll call our test kitchen. We used it as a way to begin to understand how to use many of the tools that Jim and John and David have pointed out to you earlier. So this we've turned this old office building into a mixed-use development. It sits on the St. Charles Avenue streetcar line. Today it is 33 what was initially apartments. They're being converted to condominiums with about 10,000 square feet of ground floor commercial space. So again, you see a slide in front of you that's our lobby of the building. We, as we started demolishing the building or the interior of the building, we found some old switchgear. That was the old electrical switchgear for the building. We found it on the 3rd floor. We preserved it, and we've featured it on the ground floor of this building, as you see in this slide. Let's go ahead and proceed.
Yeah, it should be. Is the next slide shown?
Yes.
It might be a little delay.
Okay, so the slide on the left shows the hallway. The slide on the right shows a rooftop. And a building like this used both federal and state historic tax credits. What was interesting was this building was completed. It was started right before Hurricane Katrina. And those of you that are part of this webinar that may not be from New Orleans have to realize that in spite of the fact that we are 11 plus years post-Katrina, our lives still revolve around that hurricane. Now, interestingly, one of the things that the federal government gave us to help us recover from Hurricane Katrina was some legislation called the Go Zone legislation. And part of that Go Zone legislation increased the federal historic tax credit from a 20% credit to a 26% credit. And in spite of the fact that this property, the construction began before the hurricane, it did qualify for the 26% credit. In addition to that, the state of Louisiana has a 25% credit. So the combination of the two, and as those of you that are just becoming familiar with those tax credits, it's not only the construction cost, but it's what we call the hard and soft costs of the project. So, so developers' fees are included, and architectural fees, and legal fees, and interim financing, and not just the hard construction cost. Interestingly, you know, our lives as kind of urban multifamily designers is changing, where when we designed these initial apartments in Union Lofts, we had about 750 square foot 1-bedroom units, and we thought of them as tiny. Today, our perception is a 750 square foot 1-bedroom unit is large. But you see from this slide, what we did is we created a series of sliding walls, sliding partitions, separating the living space from the bedroom space, almost creating the option of opening it up like a studio or closing it down like a one-bedroom. And in doing so, it began to give us an understanding and tool in saying that we can, as architects, we can create environments where people can control their own environment, can control the way they want to live. Do they want to keep it wide open? Do they want to close it down? And so you see, again, a series of 1, 2, and 2-bedroom with a studio floor plans. And even though this is a historic building, again, you see modern interiors in a historic building. And as I said before, if you understand and live with the rhythm and the scale and the proportions of the past, you can certainly look to the future. The building that we just looked at, in addition to those historic tax credits, used a very interesting financing tool. The federal government has a loan program through HUD called the HUD 221D4 program. And it's a 40-year non-recourse loan. Non-recourse means that there's no personal guarantees on the debt. And it's a very bureaucratic process, just like low-income housing tax credits are and many of the other tools that we use. But it allows us, and I describe us as little guys with big dreams. It allows us to really expand our dreams and to be able to do things at a scale larger than we can otherwise do them. And so once we got through the process on Union Lofts and we were ready to tackle our next downtown New Orleans project, we said, look, it's no more bureaucratic to do a project of 2 or 3 or 4 times as large. And so let's look to that and let's tackle that. And so we got a building under control under option called the Maritime Building. Now it is a very historic building. It's the oldest high-rise in New Orleans, built in 1893, and it is beautifully located on the corner of Carondelet Street and Common Streets. Carondelet is the street that once you cross Canal Street becomes Bourbon Street. Now if you look at that photograph that we have in front of you, you'll see some interesting wires or lines kind of crisscrossing the photograph, and what those are the power lines for the St. Charles Avenue streetcar line. So again, this property sits just 2 blocks from the previous property that we showed you, both of them on the St. Charles Avenue streetcar line. And as Jim indicated to you, you cannot underestimate or underplay or undersell the value of that transit option to downtown urban living and to this location. And certainly I would tell you that when we survey, so when you look at the use of this building, the ground floor is commercial, the second floor with those arched windows are offices, and I'm actually talking to you right now from that building. I office in that building, and I'm on the right side of that photograph in the second arch from all the way in the right, and I'm sitting there looking out of that window right now speaking with you. And above us, above the second floor, we have 105 apartments. And we have surveyed our tenants numerous times in this building, asking who has their own personal transportation and how often they use it and so forth. And I can tell you that less than 50% of our tenants own automobiles. And those that do commonly say to us, it is time to rethink the need and the use of that vehicle because they find it parked far more often than they use it, and they know that the transportation alternatives that are out there right in front of them, whether it's a taxi or whether it's the streetcar or whether it's a bus, or Uber, really shows us today in urban living the need for an automobile is becoming less and less. You can see some archival photographs of the building. And then we'll show you a little bit of how we've transformed it. So let's just run through a few of these, John, if we may. Building is a U-shaped building, and so again we have we've got apartments that have face out to the street, and you experience kind of the life of the city and the street noise, and some that are inside of the U that are a little bit quieter. Now we took that same back up. Yeah, you stop there if you would, John. We took that same approach with the sliding walls that we were showing you in the Union Lofts. The difference is Union Lofts, the bedrooms were interior space, and we got borrowed light through a translucent material in the sliding wall or the sliding panel. In this case, our bedrooms do have their own natural light, but we still enjoyed and liked the flexibility of being able to open and close the space. So you see we used an opaque sliding partition as opposed to a translucent sliding partition. Now this building is, the economics were highly complex. It used state historic tax credits and federal historic tax credits and state new markets tax credits and federal new markets tax credits and the same HUD 221D4 loan, and then we got what's called a restoration tax abatement. We got tax relief for a 5-year period where our taxes were held at the pre-development rate for the first 5 years after the development opened. Now, one of the things that David was indicating to you with historic tax credits, and John, if you would just hold on this slide for a minute or two, you only can achieve those credits, you only qualify for them for the square footage that you're working on within the building's envelope. So if you build on the rooftop, for instance, the credits don't apply. You cannot seize those credits. So we did something creative here where we said, okay, why don't we remove part of the roof on the 11th floor of this building and sink our swimming pool into that area, make it open to the sky, and because it's within that building's envelope, it did qualify for federal and state historic tax credits. Now, if you look at that photograph, this is really just a wonderful view of downtown New Orleans and really what the fabric is all about. So you see the existing steel roof structure of the Maritime building. You look beyond that and you see this building that was also an office building that's been converted to residential. And then the layer behind it is a 50-story 1980s or early 90s, probably 1980s modern office building. And so part of what makes New Orleans unique is the combination of the old and new, and the fact that we as a community understood how important it is and was to keep our urban landscape, our urban fabric, and preserve it, at least from the exterior. That's one of the things that makes our city unique. There was a wonderful architect who passed away about 1.5 years ago by the name of Alan Askew, who practiced his whole career in New Orleans. And he used a word that I have picked up and use all the time today, and that's authentic. So if one were to describe New Orleans, the word authentic has got to play into it. Now, when you look at a building like the Maritime building or Union Lofts or this building, which is the Saratoga building, there are 3 words that we oftentimes use to describe these buildings, and one of them is catalytic, that they become catalysts for change. A second is transformative, that they, and if you would, John, hold on this slide a minute, that they become a catalyst to transforming a neighborhood. Now this building sits on the very edge of downtown New Orleans, and it sits on at the intersection of Loyola and Tulane Avenues. It was the only one of our developments that was not on a streetcar line, And interestingly, and I guess fate would say it was meant to be, there today is a streetcar line called the Loyola streetcar line that has been added. So it now sits again on one of our newest streetcar lines. But when you look at the impact of this one building on this neighborhood, since we have completed this building, all the surrounding buildings were either underused or vacant. When this building had sat vacant and on the market for years and years, and people looked at it and said, well, it's on the edge of the downtown, it's too far from the center, it really has no value. And we turned around 180 degrees as opposed to looking towards the downtown. The slide on the right shows looking across the street. You'll see City Hall, and if we were to able to pan to the right, we have Tulane University Medical Center and hospital. So we looked at this as saying, no, our market is not the downtown market. Our market is the medical market. And we were certainly correct in doing so. Let's go ahead and proceed. So the building, again, is 15 stories tall, 155,000 square feet. Now, what's a historic building? Is this building that we just saw a historic building? Well, interestingly, in that historic district that it now sits in, it actually was not in, and the historic district was drawn around this building and basically ignored this building. And what Jim didn't tell you, or David, but these historic districts also have periods of significance. So this building, the Saratoga building, sat adjacent to a historic district. This building was built in 1956, but the period of significance in this historic district was 1940. So even though a building may be 50 years old or coming close to turning 50 years old, it wouldn't qualify if it wasn't built before 1940. So we had a lot to tackle, and we accomplished it all. And what we had to tackle was to get the Department of the Interior, the National Park Service, to expand the historic district to include this building, and to update the period of significance from 1940 to 1956. So it did qualify, and we've accomplished it all. I'd love to take credit for it, but there's a gentleman by the name of Bill McCrosty with a company called McCrosty Historic Advisors based in Washington, D.C., that took the lead in getting this accomplished for us. So what that did was it took a building that really virtually had no value and allowed it to qualify for state and federal historic tax credits. And to put it in perspective for you, we bought this building for $2.1 million, for about $14 a square foot, and it qualified for almost $14 million worth of tax credit equity. So almost 7 times the acquisition price of the building. So you can see how powerful a tool it is. Let's go ahead and proceed. Today it's 155 apartments. And you can get a feel for them. Again, it uses that same sliding wall system. And clearly and keenly beyond this building, the streetcar, there were two things, catalytic things that happened. Number one, that we pioneered by doing the Saratoga building, and number two, the streetcar line. And so when you look at what's happening around us today, since we've completed it, there's a second apartment building that's been completed about 2 years ago. A third one just opened. A fourth one is under construction, and 2 hotels are under construction. And I would dare say none of this would have happened had we not taken that first step and had the city not followed through with a transportation option for the neighborhood. So let's move on to the fourth one. you know, here I talk about living downtown and not needing an automobile. But in life, I would say to you, you sell what you have. You promote what you have. There's a building it's a 4-story building that's about 150,000 square feet called Stevens Garage. And it was built in 1951 as a car dealership. It was initially a Buick dealership, became a Chevrolet dealership, but has virtually been unused for almost 20 years. Today we own it. We just call it The Garage, and it's going to be a mixed-use development. You see the streetcar right there. It's also on that same streetcar on Carondelet Street, on the St. Charles Avenue streetcar line, and we're turning it into a mixed-use development. The ground floor will have about 21,000 square feet of retail. Floors 2, 3, and 4 will be apartments, and the 5th floor will be condominiums. And the 5th floor is new construction, sits outside of the building's envelope, so we don't have to hold it for that prescriptive period that you have to hold real estate if you use historic tax credits. That part of it we can bifurcate, and we can sell those units up front as opposed to waiting over that 5-year period. Now what's interesting is that we're taking out all the car ramps, and we're adding 2 car elevators, and you can see them if you look to the left of your slide. Almost in the middle of the image you'll see vehicular elevator. So if you live here and you come home by car, on the ground floor you drive your car into an elevator, takes you up to the floor you live on, the other door opens, you drive out, and you see really right kind of in the hole in the donut is where you park, and we wrap residential units around 3 sides. So when I said earlier, you sell what or promote what you have. In this case, we say, oh, you love your automobile? Oh, you're not ready to give it up yet? But you don't like the inconvenience of moving your groceries from your parking garage that may be a block or 2 away from where you live up into your apartment. In this case, you can virtually park your car right in front of your apartment. Go ahead, let's proceed. Now, little tongue-in-cheek, what we've done, back up 1 slide, if you would. You can see the floor plans, and again, we continue with that same theme of flexibility and lifestyle by opening the bedroom up to the living room and dining room, but instead of a sliding partition, go to the next slide. You'll see kind of in the middle of the slide, part of what really is a translucent glass and aluminum garage door. In the partially, it's partially down, so you can close off your bedroom from the living room by closing that garage door, and in the open position, it forms like a canopy over the bed. We hope to start construction on this in the next 2 or 3 months. We're excited by it, and so excited that we have now gained control of an adjoining parcel that's on St. Charles Avenue. So once again, we'll be in a streetcar line, and we've got some interesting ideas that we look forward to sharing with you in the future. It'll have a retail component. We'll have parking for the retail, but otherwise we will have no parking for this newest development. It's on the corner of St. Charles and St. Joseph. We've nicknamed it Two Saints, but it will have a 1,500 square foot bike room, and we're looking at devices almost like you see when you go to the dry cleaners and they retrieve your laundry, that almost conveyor system. We are looking at something like that to be able to hang bikes on, where you can push a button and retrieve your bicycle. So it'll be very bicycle oriented, but also on the streetcar line. So John, thank you very much for including me. Look forward to further discussion.
Thank you so much, Marcel. as you can tell, Marcel is one of the pioneering developers in downtown New Orleans and trying to really understand how to promote downtown living in a way that is transit-oriented. And certainly one of the leaders in this that Jim Amdal referenced earlier is Press Kabacoff. Press has pioneered a lot of important projects, not just in New Orleans, but in cities all over the country. He is the executive chairman of the board of directors for HRI Properties. Press, welcome to the webinar.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Well, good. Well, let me ask you, John, did you have a pointer? Does that work on this?
Can you see a pointer?
Yeah, I can see a pointer. Well, good. I may ask you to, and I can't do that myself. You have to do it, right?
Yes.
Okay. Well, let me tell you, I enjoyed Marcel's presentation. That's the only one I heard. So if I'm repetitive, just stop me. I thought I would just take a chapter of our HRI life here and talk about that, the chapter that relates most closely to streetcar lines. And so what I'm referring to in the PowerPoint is the transformation of Iberville and downtown New Orleans, revitalizing a great city. Let me say that I'll tell you when to go next, and that's fine. I'm glad you've gone, but I will tell you if you let me go big picture. Go a couple slides forward till you get a map of the city. Stop there. To understand New Orleans, and I assume that we have people, everyone on the phone is not from New Orleans?
Correct. It's a national crowd.
All right. Well, then I won't waste your time. The New Orleans, if you look at that picture, you see the Lake Pontchartrain on the north and the Mississippi River on the south. We're really famous for the old city, which is known as the Sliver on the River, which goes all the way from the Industrial Canal on the right, and actually further than that, but the main old city goes from the Industrial Canal to the parish line. We have parishes instead of counties, so Orleans is a parish, and Jefferson Parish on the west would be Jefferson Parish. So from the Industrial Canal to Jefferson Parish is 9 miles. And for the most part, from river to lake is 5 miles. And so that's our old historic city, with the oldest part being what you call the Sliver on the River, which is about 9 neighborhoods running from the Industrial Canal along the river all the way to the parish line. Those nationally will certainly have heard of the French Quarter, and that's right in the center of it. And the reason that's our historic property is that the river brings alluvial soil down, and until we channelized it about 150 years ago with levees, the river would flood every year and deposit soil and create all southern Louisiana. And it would leave high ground close to the river. And so those neighborhoods close to the river are high ground. And when I mean high ground, that's 5 feet to 10 feet. Not real high, but it's certainly higher than the center, which might be 4 feet below sea level. That became painfully apparent during our biblical event, Katrina, in 2005, when the inflow canals, you could point those out, the ones that go into the lake, there's several of those. They hadn't been maintained since Hurricane Betsy in the 60s, and they all broke. And the water from the lake poured into the canals, which poured into the cities, and in a day we lost 200,000 homes. And so high ground is very important to the city. New Orleans, like most older inner cities, particularly with high minority populations, and we have one, saw a major decline from late 60s through, well, almost the turn of the century. In our case, Orleans Parish had a population of 670,000 people in the 1960s, and before Katrina in 2005, the population had gone to 440,000. Another example of a city that we worked in, St. Louis, we had 900,000 previously in St. Louis County. It went down to 350,000. And so we were following a pattern of flight and the development of the suburbs that was happening all around the country, and the word was, you got to tear down these historic buildings and make parking lots because you can make more money. And so that's the framework in which we got started at HRI. One of my assignments was working with my dad. We helped to put together a World's Fair in 1984. And the World's Fair, John's pointing out with his pointer, was in our downtown area. Our downtown is really an old town. Most cities have these same ingredients. An old town we call a French Quarter. And then you have a central business district, usually an historic one, that with later time modern buildings being developed adjacent to it, modern high-rises. And most older cities had a transportation area. We called ours, once we got started, the warehouse district. And that transportation area had a great group of industrial buildings, warehouse buildings, that served the shipping industry on the Mississippi River. Very vibrant, our most powerful industry for many years. Now tourism is, but at that time shipping, and then later oil and gas, and then later tourism. That area had become derelict because the shipping industry had moved from containers, from stevedores, where goods being unloaded on the pallets by a lot of workers, and instead they put goods in boxes, and they called them containers, and you could not house containers in the downtown area. There just wasn't enough room. So that location for shipping no longer worked, in this entire warehouse district. Lots of old historic warehouses became vacant and abandoned, and that's where we decided to put a World's Fair. And one of my jobs was to assemble the 80 acres of buildings under short-term leases for the World's Fair, promising landowners that it would be improved by the World's Fair, and when it was turned back, and developers like I became would buy those properties. And that's what happened. The World's Fair was actually a disaster at the box office, but a tremendous success in urban renewal. And this was back in the 80s, 1984, and to prepare for and understand that neighborhood, I went to Soho and to New York, and NoHo and North End, where the university is in New York City, and North End to Boston, and saw that they were taking their historic warehouses and converting them into residential housing, because they had these high ceilings and great old brick materials and pine columns and large windows that let the light in. There wasn't as much electricity those days. And so it just occurred to me immediately that this would make great housing. Nobody had lived in the warehouse district for, well, 100 years. It was residential in the beginning, and then it went to warehouses to serve the shipping industry, and then vacated, as I say, and so that was a tabula rasa. You had the opportunity to develop in that area. And so we did. We got our start there in that warehouse district in 1984. I actually bought a building subject to the lease to the World's Fair, and we ended up pioneering and converting that really into the first residential. One other developer did the same, but residential development in the warehouse district. We did 6 or 7 buildings in that area after that, but that got it all started, and it was very difficult. This historic conversion is not for the faint-hearted. The challenge of designing within a particular space, of tying together all of these tax credits, working on environmental issues. It's very fortunate that there is a federal incentive, and which Marcel talked about, the historic tax credit, and in Louisiana and a number of states that put companion state tax credits, which allow you to raise almost 40% of a project cost through selling tax benefits. Those benefits are necessary to make these kind of deals pencil because of their complexity. And they're downtown, and there are lots of community concerns about what you do there. So the critical path is triple what you would have on a roadside kind of deal. That being said, it makes great real estate. And so let's go back with that framework about the city. Let's go back to the beginning. New Orleans. Again, this is not an aerial photograph, but there's the same map of the city. You see the river, the downtown area. New Orleans was lined with 600 miles of streetcars, and that conspiracy that you all already may have discussed in the late 60s, where the automobile and the tire and the trucking and the rubber companies got together and bought every streetcar line in major cities and closed them all down to make way for the automobile. A tragedy in many ways, because we're now trying to put them back in. But New Orleans had 600 miles of that, and and I've worked on a couple of them. One is a riverfront project, which was the first reintroduction of a streetcar in the city. Streetcars in the city are very expensive per mile. You're talking about 40 or 50 million bucks, because you've got to play with the old infrastructure and dig up the streets and disrupt neighborhoods. And really, at the end of the day, you wonder whether it makes any sense financially, but people seem to love the streetcars, and development grows around it. So I think indirectly they actually are a benefit despite their extraordinary cost. I was asked to put together, reintroduce a streetcar line along the Mississippi River. There was already existing tracks there, and Jim Amdal, I don't know, did Jim speak, John?
Yeah, Jim spoke about that particular corridor.
All right, so he's probably covered that. I think what's rather remarkable about it, though, is that despite the cost per mile, when you go through the normal public arena, we did a public-private partnership. Jim played a very important role in that, and we had a deadline. We had to have it done for the 88 Republican convention, which was going to be staged. That was when Bush the Elder was nominated, and so we had a year and a half to put it together, and we did it in a year and a half, and I think for about 4 or 5 miles, 4 or 5 million a mile. That's what a public-private partnership can do under pressure, under time pressure. So there are better ways to get that done than just going through the public, if you can pull that off. Anyway, that was the reintroduction of streetcars in the city. So more recently, after Katrina, what we call downtown New Orleans, which is on the downriver side of Canal Street. You're now on the uptown side. Go to the downriver side. Downtown New Orleans is everything from Canal Street, which divides the city in the center, to the Industrial Canal. That whole area was underutilized. All of the revitalization of the city really happened on the uptown side in Old Central Business District, the Lower Garden District, and uptown. But I was particularly interested in revitalizing downtown after Katrina under the notion that these historic neighborhoods, if you have a number of them, can be a great calling card for your city. For instance, New York in the 80s, when it was in such difficulty, really focused on neighborhood revitalization, the Chelseas and the Sohos and the, all of those Tribecas, all of those neighborhoods they focused on. And so New Orleans has wonderful old neighborhoods. Matter of fact, the whole new urbanism concept of walkable neighborhoods from live, work, and play are nothing more than copying what we've had for years through French Quarters and Garden Districts and the rest of it. And so if you could add to that inventory of exciting neighborhoods and start the revitalization of what you call Marigny or Bywater. So I had a civic goal after Katrina of improving that area of the city because I'd moved down there. And the way to do that was to convert some historic buildings at important intersections on corridors. If you remember, after Katrina, we lost 200,000 homes, but you did not lose homes on the riverside of the major corridors along the river because they were high ground, but everything on the lakeside was underwater. And so the notion that I had and others was if we could start to revitalize the Marigny and the Bywater and the St. Claude neighborhoods along the downtown major corridors, that would add dramatically to the city. And so one of the things I did was promoted a streetcar line through a PowerPoint, which you may know of through the Streetcar Named Desire, Marlon Brando's Streetcar Named Desire. They pulled that out in the early 60s, but the late 60s. But we were able to reintroduce that and get the Regional Transit Authority to come up with $70 million of bonding capacity and run that line in the downtown section, which has really put an emphasis on revitalizing those neighborhoods. And so go to the next slide. If I look at the pictures, the picture in the lower left is the St. Charles streetcar line, which was the one, if I'm correct there, is that right? St. Charles streetcar line, that actually was not pulled out. And so New Orleans has been famous for its famous historical St. Charles street line, which I think is the oldest in the country. It ran
in the world.
In the world. There you go, in the world. Yep. And then the riverfront streetcar that we discussed, that Jim Amdal and I and a couple of others put together in a public-private partnership, is in the lower right. And then more recently, the Canal Street streetcar, which is the return of the Canal Street streetcar, which is actually called the Cemetery Line, runs to our cemeteries. Let's go to the next one. And so again, we're talking about the city, and what happens in these historic neighborhoods is that they mature. So when we started in the warehouse district, it was a candy store of available historic buildings. There's nothing left there. It's now a neighborhood in our warehouse district of 3,500 people and office buildings and restaurants and clubs. I guess as good an example as there is in the country of a revitalized historic area. The same with our old central business district. Again, the pre-depression buildings have all been utilized for hotels and apartments. And so if you're in this historic renovation business, which we are at our company, you have to look for the next neighborhood. And one of the ways to look for them is to identify what you might call urban adjacent neighborhoods. There's a particularly good thinker in this area, Chris Lineberger. Both John Renne and I are on an organization that he founded called Locus, which is a very clever thing. The 124 nonprofits that have been trying to influence Congress to reintroduce light rail and transportation systems into cities rather than build more rural roads, because that's where people live. We're not getting very far with Congress. And so they formed, they looked for the developers in the country, the good guy developers that were caring about cities. We're one of those, and there are lots of other ones, but not that many, but there are a number of major developers, and they formed together a group called Locus, and we've actually been successful getting Congress to expand the incentives through TIFIA and RIF. I won't go into all those details, but they're just ways to pay for infrastructure around transportation systems with low-cost federal financing, which you'll find if you're going to go into a downtown urban adjacent neighborhood, and again, find yourself in a pioneering mode, you need every incentive that you can find. And so,
for those of you who attended our committee meeting in Washington, D.C. last January, Christopher Lineberger and Christopher Coase spoke about RIF and TIFIA, so you may remember that's what press is referring to.
So I was interested in developing the center of the city on the river side, on the lake side of our Old Town, French Quarter and CBD. And had identified, go next slide, identified an area in that trapezoid, 2-lane, Rampart, St. Bernard, and Broad Street, which is about 2.5 times the size of the French Quarter. So a bold undertaking, to say the least. But the big picture was New Orleans is a great old city, and it's healthy on the riverfront and healthy on the lakefront, and its problems are that 9-mile swatch in the center going from east to west. And if you could dramatically improve the center and connect the river to the lake, I did a PowerPoint on this and called it the Afro-Caribbean Paris. In Paris, you know that you can walk 50 or 100 blocks without having an interesting experience the whole way. And New Orleans has that opportunity if you could just fix the center. So that was the goal. And then we had done in our company Hope 6 deals, which is to take public housing projects, mix income and public-private partnership with the feds, privatize communities. There was a public housing development right in the center of that trapezoid called the Iberville Housing Project, a historic development. And they came out with a program, an iterative improvement on the Hope 6, which was called the Choice Neighborhood Programs. The Fed did that. And the basic premise was not only fix the project, mix income, updated, et cetera, but fix the neighborhood around it and have programs for people, et cetera. So it's a much more comprehensive program. We were successful in applying HRI for that development, and so which was perfect for what I wanted to accomplish, which was to revitalize an entire neighborhood with a tough inner city housing project right in the center. So go to the next slide. When I said that that's 2.5 times the size of the French Quarter, in other words, these whole neighborhoods are about 400 acres. And so this is probably almost 1,000 acres of downtown adjacent property. And so pulling something like that off is quite an undertaking. But when you really looked at it, and I've circled up some pictures here, you look at the southern side, at the bottom of the picture, you have strength on the riverside, which is Warehouse District, Central Business District, and French Quarter, neighborhoods that are very healthy now. And then on the other side of what they call Rampart, as you move toward the lake, you had the Iberville housing development right in the center, which we are now revitalizing and almost done. We've done 500 or 600 units there. You had a Lafitte Greenway, which is an old railroad track line that has now become a park. You have the Municipal Auditorium, which still needs renovation, but it was a nice historic auditorium. And then you had Louis Armstrong Park, which is a 32-acre inner city park. You'd kill for to have, to have a park like that. Then on the other side of that, you have the Treme neighborhood, which is now made famous by the video about the Treme and all the music and historic homes. And as you move to the west, you have a large empty hospital, the Charity Hospital Complex, and then Government Center, our Superdome and football stadiums, and they're putting a lot of money into that area. And then we've just spent almost $3 billion on a new medical facility in the Bio District. So when you look at all those pieces, you had enough ingredients there to start major real estate development. And it was all interconnected by streetcar lines. The ones that I've told you about, Canal Street and Rampart was the old Desire line. So they're all back. And so this is a neighborhood waiting to happen. Next slide. So if you look at it in the aerial, again, you can see Iberville Housing Project. John will point that out, which is now, if you look at the picture on the right, revitalized by us into what you see there. And then if you go to the west of Iberville, you see Canal Street, our major corridor. You see a lot of vacant parking lots where they tore down historic buildings. And as you move further to the west, you see a massive historic Charity Hospital, which was emptied out in order to build the new hospitals. Very volatile subject. That's a whole other story. We'll talk about that some other conference. But in any event, I had an interest in revitalizing that hospital in the city hall and the courts, and then some for residential because it was 1 million square feet. You needed an anchor tenant. And then taking the vacant lots, which you see in parking between Iberville and the hospital, and doing retail. So create a retail center because it's well located, and anchor it with an improved development with Iberville on one side and Charity on the other. Well, Iberville's underway. Charity has been bandied around about for years, and the state's going out with its second RFP. Will apply. But the bottom line is that the warehouse district is mature, the old central business district is mature, the French Quarter has been mature for 200 years, and so if you're looking to continue historic revitalization, you have to look at adjacent downtown neighborhoods or something that has museums or hospitals or universities near them as the next place, because they all create walkable environments. And the Canal Street streetcar runs back, and we talked about, John mentioned that the Locust Group in the last conference in Boston talked about RIF and TIFIA, and these become ripe for projects that can get those kinds of infrastructure loans and make the difference between a project you can't pull off because the infrastructure is too expensive, that you can pull off by getting low-cost federal loans. For the next one. There was a high-rise office building right on that major street that was empty, and we converted it into elderly housing as part of the revitalization of the Iberville project. Again, that's a historic conversion using every subsidy under the sun, particularly the historic ones, and affordable tax credits, which is another major subsidy, and created housing for the elderly that were relocated out of the Iberville project. Next slide. Again, when you look at that area, again, that's a historic view of the old Canal Street, but there were great theaters old theaters, the Sanger Theater, the Lowe's Theater, the Orpheum Theater, which are now, and Joy Theater, which are now all being converted. And when you're going to do shopping, you know, shopping will, besides women apparels and restaurants and home furnishings, likes to have entertainment. And so if you develop shopping in that area, you have entertainment right as part of the mix. So those will all be assets for this revitalization of this adjacent neighborhood. Next one. And then this is a picture of that great old hospital, which was done sort of a knockoff of Lincoln Center, a Rockefeller Center in New York, the same architecture. So our proposal was to do City Hall and the courts in a couple of the wings, and then some residential. The courts didn't want to play, and so it's gone back to the state, which is the owner, and they're going to come out with an RFP, and that will be a mouthful of a renovation. And we're looking now at doing residential and bioscience type offices in it. We'll see how that works out. I think that concludes that discussion. John, is this question and answers, or am I finished, or what?
Yeah, I'm just flicking through the last couple slides. So we have run to the end of the time. Happy to stay a little bit late. If people have questions and answers, or if you have questions, we can provide some answers. A couple of things I just want to point out is that one of our sponsors of this, the new TOD Institute, they have a bunch of resources on their website also, which is tod.org, so you can get information on there about principles, elements of TODs, various recommendations for reports, books, videos, etc. And they just had a conference in Washington, D.C. that was a fantastic conference, and they'll be doing more in the future. I don't see any questions in the box. Some people asked if the presentation will be available for download. Yes, we will make the video of this webinar available. We did have one question, I guess, here for Marcel. It said, for the garage in the middle of the units, how are the fumes from the exhaust dealt with, given residential units are surrounding them?
That's an interesting question, and not only are residential units surrounding 3 sides, but the 4th side is enclosed because it's on a property line. But if we were to go back to that slide, or if you look at it, if you download the presentation, you'll see 4 big areas in the middle. 2 of them are supply air, and 2 of them are exhaust air. So codes require a certain amount of air movement, air exchanges. There you see actually four blackened in areas on each side. So one side is supply and the other side is exhaust. And so in spite of the uniqueness of the uses, this project meets all current codes.
Okay, well, I think that's all the time we have right now. I want to thank all of the speakers and the sponsors who helped to make this possible. I'd like to encourage you, if you do have follow-up questions, go ahead and email myself. I can put you in touch with the speaker on this panel that can, get an answer to your question. Please download the guidebook on historic preservation and TOD. Watch the video as well, and hopefully this will be a useful tool for you and your communities. Let me just check and see if there's any last questions. It looks like that's it. So I want to close this webinar. Again, thank all the speakers and the sponsors. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you so much.